Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Eric Wishart. I'm a member of the club's professional committee, and I'd like to give a very warm welcome tonight to Jose, who is the president of the Hong Kong. I'm looking at it. Macau. I get too much Hong Kong in my head.
Portuguese and
so
English.
Jose is the president of the Macau Portuguese and English Press Association. And I've been down to Macau. I actually spoke at one of your events, and it's a very dynamic organization. There's more than 100 members now. And how long have you been in existence?
12 years, over 12 years.
12 years, right? But it's really accelerated recently.
I
think that recently, I think last year with the typhoon, when the Macau blocked Hong Kong journalists from going into Macau to cover it, was a bit of a wake-up call, because Macau, compared to Hong Kong, makes a lot of noise, and Macau's slightly off the radar. So, I mean, I think this is why it's so interesting to have Jose here tonight, and thank you for coming to give us a rundown on actually what's happening in Macau, what the press. I mean, you did a study into press freedom in Macau, and the general consensus on the surface was it's not that bad. But I mean, honestly, if you're blocking Hong Kong journalists from getting to cover a natural disaster, it's not that good either. And there's also this sort of strange thing where a lot of the Macau media is subsidized, or partly subsidized by the government. So I think you've got quite a lot to talk about. So Jose's got a presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A. So thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's really especially meaningful for me to be here. We was about a year ago when I took office as president of the association that I paid you a visit, and I received this warm welcome, and it's really great that we are nurturing this relationship with the Foreign Correspondents Club. I think it's important that we get to know each other better, so we know better about each one of us challenges and the environment. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'm a bit nervous, so I'll try. Okay, let's move on. A little bit about, well, okay, so I'm going to talk, of course, about Portuguese and English media landscape, not solely, but primarily because of the name of the association. That's what I know better. Our association was established in 2005. Over the last couple of years, we're trying to shake things up. I'm going to talk about what we've been doing. Myself, so my name is, José Carlos Matias. I'm originally from Portugal. I arrived in Macau 15 years ago, so I've seen a few things after the handover, unfortunately, but I was a bit young back then. But I remember quite well the handover ceremony, of course. It was a big thing back in Portugal. And I arrived just before the boom, the liberalization of the gaming industry. It was in 2004 when we had that huge thing of Sands opening, and that was the game, literally game or gamble changing for Macau. And I will mention that because it had an impact on media development. You can see the front pages of some newspapers. Most of them are in Portuguese, and there's something over there in English as well. We're going to talk about it. So let's look at this newspaper. Everything started in 1822. This is the very first newspaper, modern newspaper, but of course, we're talking about 19th century. 1882, Abelha da China was the first newspaper published, I think I can say in China, I guess, in many ways. It was a short-lived newspaper. It was a liberal-minded newspaper, liberal in the sense of the politics of the time, of course. It caused some trouble to the then colonial government. So it had a Portuguese critical stance on the local authorities. It's a very interesting case, and this is the beginning of a journey that is taking us to today. And this highlights the importance of Portuguese-speaking media and Portuguese-speaking newspapers in Macau. I mean, as you know, Macau's handover took place on the 20th of December 1999. So I will be talking a bit about Portuguese media before the handover. We had 2 daily newspapers and 2 weeklies. No English daily paper. There were some attempts, and let me correct something, which is, of course, throughout the history, especially, well, 19th century and 20th century, we did have English language newspapers. Especially during World War II, we had an influx of refugees, many coming from Hong Kong and also from Shanghai, because Macau, as part of the Portuguese Empire, was in Portugal took a neutral stance on World War II. But the point is that there were no established English language daily newspapers before the handover. So this is basically the picture anxiety over the post-handover situation. The content of these newspapers was heavily focused on Portugal's legacy, heritage, language, cultural, legal system, and there was a great deal of uncertainty as for what would come next after the handover. And then what happened after the handover was something that is in a way surprising, taking into account what people were expecting. I'm quoting from people that I've spoken to. I was not yet based there. So what we have now is a situation where one can say that Macau has arguably the highest media density in the world if you look at Macau as a jurisdiction, of course, because we have daily newspapers, 13 in Chinese, 3 Portuguese, 2 English, then weeklies. We have free-to-air TV, the public service broadcaster. By the way, that's where I work. I work for TDM, which is a public service broadcaster. I've been working for TDM for 15 years, though I'm not here in any way as a TDM journalist, but on behalf of the association. So these are my own views, of course. So we have, of course, the newswires. And the Macau population stands currently at about 650,000. So you can see, and the square kilometers, I think it's like, I don't know, because we keep on having 34. Thank you very much, Emily. Because we have new land reclamations, you know, so I'm always a bit confused. So, I mean, you can do the maths and can see, oh, my God, how come this is possible, right? And I'm going to explain a bit of it, the rationale behind it and the way we've got it here. Okay, after the handover in 2002, the government increased the subsidies to newspapers. So that's a bit of one of the many distinctive and unique features of Macau. This is something that comes way before the handover. It was first coherently established in the early 1990s, which is a subsidy for periodicals, dailies and weeklies. They got to meet a couple of criteria. Mainly, they have to have been published for at least 5 straight years with no interruption, no break. And also, they have to be in one of the 2 official languages of Macau, Chinese and Portuguese. These subsidies are aimed at, you know, supporting printing the newspaper, production, modernization, technological modernization, etc. So this is an important factor to help us understand the reason why we have this media density, of course. Not the only one, because we have politically this decision by the central government of setting up this forum for cooperation between China and the Portuguese-speaking countries headquartered in Macau. So this was in 2003. Why is this important? Because this somehow framed the presence of the Portuguese culture, Portuguese community, and of course, also Portuguese newspaper, this is my understanding, indirectly, differently. Not anymore solely as a sort of something as a remain of colonial legacy, but as part of something that is encompassed in a wider strategy of China's global activeness. I mean, this is the looming narrative, if I may say, just to give a bit of background for the acceptance somehow, political acceptance and support also to Portuguese-speaking media. Indirectly, let me tell you, this is my own view. The liberalization of the gaming industry, as I was saying, this is the game changer, 2004. Well, everything changed. I guess most of you have been to Macau. Some of you have been to Macau before Sands opened. So that's basically the watershed. And this had an impact, of course, because GDP skyrocketed. Gaming operators started advertising in newspapers as well. Of course, for sure. The government's, of course, government surplus kept on swelling. So there was plenty of money around, as it's been the case since then. And this is, of course, a key factor. Okay, influx of migrant workers due to the growth of the economy. We have about 180,000 non-resident workers. It's a specific status that you got in Macau. Most of them, of course, come from mainland China, but we do have nearly 30,000 Filipinos. It's the largest non-Chinese group. And expat professionals, thousands, and of course, English is mostly their lingua franca, the working language. So there was a demand for news in English, and there's no coincidence that that's of course why also 2004 was the year one of the daily newspapers was established, as I will be telling you in a while. New publications in Chinese and English, new blood, local talents coming from Portugal, China, Australia, Malaysia, Philippines, bilingual media outlets. There was a more diversified field, new media, social media, of course. Now, we have Portuguese newspapers. We have 3 daily newspapers, Tribuna de Macau, Ponto Final, and Hoje Macau. All 3 of them were there before the handover, though one was a weekly and the other 2 were daily newspapers. Well, of course, you can find here good stuff. You can find here some independent-minded journalism. I think I would taking into account the circumstances of Macau and small-sized newsrooms, you got some talented young journalists working there. So if you're looking for some reliable sources, generally speaking, I think that they're good. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but that's what I truly think. And you can find many different voices. There's a great deal of plurality in these newspapers. Also in English newspapers, yes. The Macau Post Daily was founded in 2004, the year when everything changed, of course. Macau Daily Times a bit later in 2007. There was another daily newspaper, Macau Business Daily, but it went paperless. So that's a bit, sign of the times, right? So it's the first case in Macau, as far as I know, or one of the first. Now, our association, it was established, as I was telling you, in 2005. Now we have about 100 members, been growing as of last month. Most of them are journalists working for Portuguese and English media outlets, but not only, because actually, despite the name, we do accept and actually would like to have more journalists, particularly Chinese-speaking journalists, joining us. So we're open, actually, that is happening, and we're happy to include more so we can be more representative. Main objectives, goals, of course, press freedom is pivotal for us, access to information, and also professional training. That's what that's something that we've been doing. Actually, Eric was with us just a couple of months ago. What was like November, right? Late November, for a workshop on ethics. So we are focusing a lot on ethics as well, as I will be telling you. Now, when you look at we look at the basic law, of course. Article 27 is our favorite one for obvious reasons. Macau residents shall have freedom of speech, of the press and publication, freedom of association, of assembly, of procession, and of demonstration, and the right and freedom to form and join trade unions and to strike. By the way, that is something that is yet to be regulated. That's another issue, but it's also related to us because we don't have collective bargaining arrangements in Macau because there's no trade union law. But if you look at the basic law, it's there. So there's ground to make that happen. Let's wait and see. It's an issue on the agenda. Maybe it's wishful thinking. Perhaps sooner or later that will come into fruition. But focusing on press freedom and right to information, we also look at the press law. This is in Portuguese, but it's direito à informação, right to information, the freedom and access to sources of information, and also the guarantee of journalist independence. And here, press freedom. So whatever we do is grounded on the basic law and the press law. So when we issue statements that we believe that are necessary because we worry that some of these fundamental and core values might be at risk of being eroded, normally we refer to this, of course, because that is key to us. We were, as Eric was saying, last year we carried out for the very first time, a survey on press freedom and access to information. Well, it's partial picture for sure. Is the first one. I hope it's the first of as a first step in a journey for a depiction of press freedom in Macau. 44 journalists, more than half of our journalist members participated in the survey. Then we appointed a third-party committee to analyze the questionnaires. And then some of the results are down there. 80% when asked whether there's press freedom said yes, and 70% said they did not face any clear violation of their press freedom rights. However, 76% say they've dealt with different types of restraint. Then I can provide the details of and break it down in terms of the kind of restraints that they faced, that they say. And most importantly, access to information. Most of them, they consider it difficult. The judiciary, of course, is a case in point in this respect. Public administration, the executive branch, the legislative branch, not so much. So the authors of the survey, I mean of the report, I shall say, highlighted that the major problem is precisely access to sources, access to information that should be public and is concealed. Let me tell you this. This is our understanding. When we look at press freedom, we should look both downstream and upstream. So it is a fact, and based on what we've gathered, that in the Portuguese and English-speaking media, if you look at the situation downstream, it is considered as satisfactory, relatively or broadly positive. However, when people are asked about, access to information, we'll look at upstream, which there's a knock-on effect, of course. It's got to be regarded in a holistic manner. Then you can see several issues being raised and problems. So this is why we do believe that these are two sides of the same coin, and to enhance press freedom in journalism, you need to have way better access to information. Of course, access to information in this case, there's a linguistic problem, of course, because it's easier to do it in Chinese than in Portuguese or English, but let's talk about the two official languages. There's problems, and of course we understand in terms of shortage of bilingual translators and interpreters, not enough. That's of course something that we are told. But anyway, I mean, we're here to expand our room and to have better access to information, and to tell them that we definitely need more, because there's an impact on the service that we provide. We had a meeting with we had meetings with government representatives on this. We expressed our views and our concerns in this respect. Ethics and self-regulation. We adopted our first code of ethics in April. The journalist statute, paving the way for our own accreditation mechanism, or for a press card of our own. And we've been doing workshops on ethics. So we think, of course, it's extremely important to promote a stronger ethical culture in our community. And all this is open to non-members. So we've been having non-members joining our events, and we actually encourage non-members journalists, and even we also have open door events with talks. So the community, because this dialogue has to be a wider one, there must be an engagement. There are many more stakeholders than ourselves. We should not keep it in the ivory tower, of course. Now, in terms of statements, it's not very clear there, but there's 2 statements. Well, we issued more last year, but these are the most noticeable, I would say. One on the removal of an article which was published in a newspaper, a weekly newspaper called Plataforma, by the Electoral Affairs Commission, because they considered that that was violating the law with regards to there's a period of time where there should be no electoral propaganda. But there was an interview to a candidate which was considered propaganda, which was there was a contentious issue, but we issued this statement saying that an interview, even if it's like that, should not be considered as such. So that we have a different understanding when we look at the electoral law and also at the press law with regards to this, compared with the Commission. And of course, something that most of you have heard, the cases of Hong Kong journalists being barred from Macau, denied entry. This is not the first time that this happened, and previously we have issued also statements, but as you know, it happened at a critical juncture after Typhoon Hato, and of course we strongly condemn this decision, and the explanation given by the authorities, of course, for us is we find it extremely hard to understand, to say the least, and that is what we have said there. We have to keep an eye on this problem, which I guess it's become relatively common, and this is a red line for us, of course. Okay, so some concluding remarks in looming challenges. There's a plurality of voices in Portuguese and English media. So it's still, I would say, an interesting and positive picture that we can draw from there. Independent-minded newsrooms, yes. Overall, I think that's very fair to say. There's obstacles in terms of access to information, definitely, as it's been shown in our survey. The weight of government subsidies and official ads in Portuguese and Chinese newspapers, of course, this is a factor. Let me tell you the following, and that's probably one of the questions that you'll have, but I think I can answer now and then go into more detail. When it comes now to Portuguese-speaking newspapers, there's nothing that we can, it's very hard, if not impossible, to single out a case where there's a casual relation between these 2 factors. That's government subsidies and the content of the newspaper not being critical of the government in that sense. So I'm not saying there is not such a thing, but I'm saying that if you read the newspapers, it's very hard, if not impossible, to single that out, because it's, as I said, you have many different voices. Opposition is getting a lot of airtime, so that also has to be said. Again, I'm talking about Portuguese media, and also further, something more concrete should be drawn upon a more in-depth survey, and that's something that we'd like to do, because as you know, the devil quite often lies in the details. But yes, overall, one has to say that. I'm talking about, again, what I can read in Portuguese newspapers, solely because that's what I can follow more closely. Dependence on ads from large-scale private companies, such as casino operators. Of course, that is more applicable to English newspapers because they are not entitled to get the direct subsidies from the government, though they may get institutional ads. But of course, this is an issue which has to do with the overall dependence of Macau on a single industry, which is, of course, reflected in the advertisement that you can get, of course. Human resources conundrum, shortage of bilingual journalists, that is a challenge, of course. Internal Security Act, Hong Kong journalists being barred. So this is the Internal Security Act, is a law that authorities invoke to prevent them from getting in, because they would pose some threat to the internal security of Macau. And the National Security Act, so contrary to Hong Kong, Macau has way long ago legislated Article 23. It was in 2009. There's a question mark there because there hasn't been a single case, okay, that we know. No, there hasn't been. So but it's there. It's been adopted. What was the final outcome was actually a bit adjusted, and if you compare to what led 500,000 people to take to the streets back in 2003 to Hong Kong, the Macau version is milder than that version, but still it is there. So it's just like it's looming in a way, potentially, we don't know. The Cybersecurity Act, well, it's being now, it's under consultation. It's too early to say anything about it. But of course, we'll keep a close eye on it for obvious reasons. Let's wait and see what comes out. Self-censorship. Again, this is always something that all of us, we believe there is plays a role in what comes out. We don't have, again, any specific, something specific that will come up with a clear picture when it comes to self-censorship. But anyway, I think it is a challenge, and it is a hypothesis for sure. And when we talk among ourselves, we don't see it obviously, but it's always something that could be looming sometime in the future. We will know. So what is the way forward for us, for our association? So we joined the International Federation of Journalists. We have Serenade here with us. That was in November 2017 as associate member, because we cannot be full members due to the fact that we're not a trade union, right? But we are an association devoted to the promotion of press freedom and the journalists' rights. We are looking at deepening our ties with other local Chinese-speaking journalist associations. Conduct new surveys to go deeper into the challenges faced by journalists. Forge closer ties with our counterparts. We got here the case and elsewhere. We also have this connection with journalists, trade unions, and associations in the Portuguese-speaking countries. We have good relations with journalist trade unions in Cabo Verde, Cape Verde, in Portugal, Brazil, Angola, Mozambique. This has been taking place and going on for quite some time. We want to strengthen these ties because we share this language, Portuguese, and it's a good platform for us to learn more about each other and to have cooperation with them. To promote a stronger ethical culture and debate, a dialogue with different government departments and institutions to raise awareness on greater transparency and better access to information. We had a couple of meetings with government representatives, so we want them to be more aware of the need to be more transparent and to allow better access to information, and to monitor new pieces of legislation and signal our stance whenever what we consider core values might be at risk of being eroded. So, and of course, more talks, training, etc. It's what we'd like to do in the future. I will say obrigado, thank you, thank you very much. So you can find the website of our association, my personal email, the association's email, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting. I would like to just start, and then I'll throw it open to the floor. Can you tell me, there's this very strict rule on coverage before the chief executive election. You didn't talk about that, but the complete blackout on coverage, right?
Oh yes, this happened it's because of the Macau, not only because of the Macau electoral law, but also due to the interpretation of the Electoral Affairs Commission. It goes roughly like this. From the day the lists of candidates are officially out until the first day of election campaign, there's propaganda is banned, okay? There can be no electoral propaganda. So we understand that. Actually, you have these similar kind of laws or regulations elsewhere. But they included what comes out in the media if it directs attention to a certain candidate or list of candidates, or against someone that is running in the election, and in their view calls on indirectly or directly for you to vote for them, that is not allowed. So the problem with that article is that, well, they had an interview with someone from a list of candidates, right? A ticket, and the guy was wearing he had the number, the list number, right? So it was an interview, a piece of, they had a journalistic treatment, so to say, approach, but it was about their platform. So, and then they consider that that would be deemed as propaganda. So that's the reason why we have this issue and this problem. What they tell us, oh, don't worry, before that day and after that day, so before and after that about 4-week period, there's no strings attached. You can report or do whatever you want, but during that period, these are the rules. So it's a matter of interpretation. So our interpretation is different from that of the Electoral Commission. Thank you.
So questions?
Thank you. I don't know if because I have a...
So basically it's a blackout on coverage.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, that doesn't mean that you may interview someone, but that person is not explicitly talking about its platform, but may talk about general ideas. Let's say you are the president of a doctors association, but it happens that you're also the number one in the ticket, and I interview you, and you talk about your association's projects for healthcare, which, by the way, may also be in your platform, but that's the trick. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, basically, yeah. I'm To Han Chi. I'm a reporter from MLEX. Basically, there's a reputation in Macau that organized crime and triads are associated with the casinos. Do journalists in Macau ever feel intimidated on reporting on certain things like organized crime because they feel intimidated by the gangsters? And also, do journalists in Macau find restrictions or censorship on reporting on some very powerful Macau families and their links to the Chinese leaders, like the family of Ma Man K, for example?
That is a great question, my friend. That's two great questions. Okay, I don't have any knowledge, direct knowledge on that, but it's also true that I don't recall, it's been some time that I've seen, some in-depth. It's not easy to conduct and carry out investigative journalism in a place like Macau, because first of all, it's a small place. Everybody knows everybody. Secondly, it's very hard to find someone who can tell you something on the record, let alone off the record, or the other way around, I shall say. And it can be very, very challenging. I guess for your question, I don't recall any piece which would touch upon something way sensitive in that respect, and then as a result having that. I don't remember any specific case, but I would presume that it might be a challenge. Thank you. Yes, thank you, but that's a great question. Yeah. But by the way, I should have greeted you first, Florence. Thank you very much, President of the Foreign Correspondents Club. So thank you very much for having me here and for being so kind. Thank you very much.
It was very much our pleasure and Eric's initiative, and it's great. And yes, we can and must support each other.
Sure.
Actually, I was just going to ask you, how do you compare the Hong Kong press with the Macau press? Because the way you wrote it, quite a few things could seem similar, but then in details and when you give examples, it still sounds quite different. For example, are these newspapers clearly identified as opposition? Do you have like the Apple Daily? Do you have the good serious newspaper like Macau?
Because I did not. Thank you very much for the question, because I did not address, of course. I don't want to call it the elephant in the room, but of course, Chinese-speaking media is the big issue, of course, because of the impact that it has, because of the, but for obvious reasons, of course. Over 90% of the population is Chinese-speaking. In Portuguese and English, newspapers tend to have a relatively, I wouldn't say neutral, but not too much of an engaged stance. But I give you an example, which is, I guess most of you have heard of this case involving a young lawmaker, pro-democracy lawmaker, Suluso. So he's about to face trial. He's been suspended by his fellow lawmakers. So in that case, the day after lawmakers decided to suspend him so he could face trial, two Portuguese newspapers had front pages and op-eds extremely critical of the decision. Very, very harsh criticism of that decision. 2 out of the 3 were openly against in a way that is very, very clear. Not even, it was not even balanced in some way. I'm not criticizing them for doing that. I'm just saying that, So it was a case. That doesn't mean that these newspapers are pro-opposition, but I guess their reporting tends to be balanced, independent-minded. But what you have in most Portuguese and English newspapers is that kind of take, right? Chinese is a different picture. You don't have anything of the scale of Apple Daily in Macau, for sure. The largest newspapers are surely inclined, and they have editorially what one can consider a pro-established stand. But we do have, let me tell you this, that's of course the case. Of course, the largest newspaper is Macau Daily, or Munyapo. You also have Wakiupo, which they are the 2 largest papers. But you also have other smaller sized newspapers, some more neutral or independent-minded, and others who would, I would say, lean more towards the pro-democracy opposition. But if you compare Hong Kong and Macau, yes, the scale is different. And I could also say the following. This is just my view. I've been based there for 15 years, and judging from my observation, generally speaking, the social fabric of Macau is, in some ways, or in many ways, different from that of Hong Kong. Cantonese speaking, yes. Southern Chinese, yes. But it's got to do with the history of both cities before and after the handover. This is to say that, okay, I'm going to use the word patriotism, right? Is something that is inherently organic in many ways to many people in Macau. Their sense of Chineseness and the sense of belonging to China and the way they face the handover is, I would say, is way different from an important segment of the population in Hong Kong. So there are historical reasons for that. It's a tale of 2 cities, right? Same but different, right? So this is to say that this is also, what you see in the media also reflects this. Also reflects not only the political economy of the Macau SAR, but also, sociologically a different place in some ways, in many ways, from Hong Kong. Of course, with similarities. This is not to say that people are not, you don't have people concerned about, preserving the distinctive features of Macau, heritage, even the legal system, of course, for sure. But not in the same way that you've got the sort of polarization that you've got in Hong Kong. It's way less polarized. And I'm saying that, from my observation, to my understanding, that is something that is, in a way, genuine in many ways, of course. Not saying that you don't have problems. Of course, you do have constraints. But I think part of the story is that one, is that you have a society which faced the handover before and after different from what I don't know if the majority, I don't know, but what share of the local Hong Kong society did, right? So that would be basically it. But the overall, like the majority of Chinese-speaking media, editorially, if you look at that, most people would agree and conclude, I don't know if most people, but at least tends to be pro-establishment.
And if I could just follow up as well on the previous question, because basically you said that the stories, which in my view would be the most interesting ones, are not covered. Is it because everyone know about it, or is it because it's too dangerous to touch?
That's a good question. That's a great question. It's not that it's not covered, but you don't have in-depth coverage of that.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
It's not. It's mentioned, maybe mentioned, but you don't see that.
But do people know, like the local people, thanks to the press, on a daily basis, maybe drop by drop? Do they understand which triad is behind which casino? And of course, all of them have gone cleaner and cleaner, apparently, because they've become richer, and one of the big one has become a sponsor of the major events and all that. So maybe they've gone cleaner and they're not even triads anymore, but still it is.
They become legitimate, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the story.
Yeah, I think that's part of the story, yes. That's part of the story. Yes, in the late 1990s, as you know, we had a lot of troubles, right, in Macau, just before the handover. And I guess back then you did have some reporting on that. And the situation has surely improved greatly after just before and then after the handover. And you're saying some of these people have moved on to a different kind of situation. But yeah, that is something that is not being discussed, not so much on the radar.
Mind you, in Hong Kong, it's not very covered either.
Yeah,
and it's also very interesting because
of course.
Yeah.
But that's
it's almost
that's
the same
fact.
question for Hong Kong.
That's a fact. Yeah. But you know, when we think about the different voices, and again, I was. That would require some research, of course. You do have some room in Chinese-speaking media for like these phone-in shows where you have people slamming government officials, etc. You do have some channels, even in media outlets which are considered more leaning towards the pro-establishment camp. But there are some channels. But again, I think what's important, and I was mentioning that, and also for us, is to better understand the circumstances and the environment where our colleagues, our comrades from Chinese-speaking media operate and their reality. There's a bridge to be built, I would say, so we better understand each other, and you can better help each other in an efficient way, of course, not to cause any problem anyway, but to help. And we are trying to do that. We have a linkage with other Chinese journalist associations. There's a welfare union, which handles an health insurance scheme, which is sponsored by the government, 90% sponsored by the government, I believe. And this is the place where, of course, we talk about some working conditions and also health insurance-related issues, but it's a way also for us to get to know each other better, and then by then, you know, if we do that, I hope that it would bear some fruits in the future. I hope so. Yeah. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just interested
Please,
in...
sorry, please just give your name.
Oh, my name's Julian Hawthorne. I work for the Hong Kong Education Department.
Hi.
And I'm just curious about what the government in Macau's education policy is regarding language, given that, you know, the different cultures represented by languages have different perceptions of what's going on. And, yeah, I'm just curious, do they promote Portuguese language? Do they promote English language? I mean, you say there's a shortage of translators. Is the government concerned about this or not?
Thank you very much. It's an interesting question. This leads me on a footnote to something. I think there's a lot of potential here for researchers, for scholars, to conduct research on these unique, all these unique features of Macau when it comes to, in the fields of sociology, communication and journalism studies, political science, etc. We've got here. Well, just allow me to single out Emily and Sonny. They've been working on that for many years, which is great. And I think it is important, even in terms of semiotics. There's a lot of potential here. Now, you were saying something interesting. Well, we've seen some investment in Portuguese. And now, actually, the number of Chinese studying Portuguese is way higher today than it was 20 years ago before the handover. Many of them come from mainland China, but not only. Yeah, that is an interesting factor. Also because, as I was saying, all this narrative and strategy of promoting closer ties with Portuguese-speaking countries, there's a focus on people-to-people exchanges, educational exchanges, professionals, events, and all that, in addition to business ties, of course, which big business does not go through Macau, but sometimes Macau is the stage for that. But in terms of people-to-people, there's a lot of things going on. Training, Emily has been working on that, and also Sonia has been looking into this issue. So we do see some effort put on that, but of course. It's not, I would say it's not yet enough, but it's moving forward in that respect, I would say.
I just want to ask you about the subsidies.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, when I went to Macau, I did this talk to the Association on Ethics, and we had lunch after with the director
of the Government Information
Director.
Bureau, yes.
And his take on it was, we really support a free press, and it's great, we're very happy to subsidize. On the other hand, it's a double-edged sword, because if, they can always withdraw the subsidy if they're not happy with you. So how do you see the role of the subsidy in the freedom of press in Macau?
Well, I think for them to withdraw the subsidy would be very hard and very difficult politically, right? Because if you look at the law, the regulation, the strings which are attached are merely technical. There's little room. I was going through it just a while ago, and as far as I can see, I don't see much room for them to do that based on not being happy with what's published. But we never know. I mean, I'm just looking at what's written in the law. We've been discussing this. It's not easy because, you see, without the subsidy from the government and the official ads, you wouldn't have 3 Portuguese language newspapers. Let's put it simply. I think that's fair to say, right? Because of the size of the community. And it turns out that the 3 Portuguese newspapers are the ones who give more airtime and more reporting to the opposition, not because they are pro-opposition, and are more independent-minded and even have op-eds criticizing the government quite often. So it is a bit of I know it's surprising. Yes, it is. Will there be any looming effect in the back of one's mind because you've got that? I would say, of course you cannot rule that out. Of course, you cannot rule that out, of course. But then if you look at the content, there's no evidence, and if you talk to the journalists, they will not also tell you that. But again, that kind of thing would require a more in-depth and fine-tuned research and approach. We would like to do it in the future because this survey that we conducted is just a first step. Actually, I have to tell you that we need to improve it in many ways because it failed to grasp perhaps a number of subtleties.
How do you explain, following on, the fact that Macau has probably got the highest media density in the world? I mean, why so many newspapers in Macau?
Well, it's like it's a legacy of history in a way, but then after the handover, you had even more, right? It's not based on the number of copies you sell, right? It's not market-based in a way that most places are. Again, the subsidies and the support by public utilities or government departments in their awareness campaigns, plus I did not mention this is also important, the judicial announcements, they have to be published in the official languages, and that is also a very important factor, by the way, as important as the government direct subsidy, because the government subsidy does not by per se guarantee that the newspaper can be up and running. Of course it helps, but it's not without extra funding it wouldn't be possible, I guess. But all this plus the booming of the GDP growth, the economy, and the fact that you have small-sized newspapers, almost family-sized. You got a number of newspapers. All of those 13 dailies that you've got, some of them are really small-sized. They are kept alive by all this, and that's basically the reason why. But also before the handover, you already had a very significant media density, though the Portuguese media and Portuguese newspapers before the handover and throughout history, you always had, normally, for most of the time, at least a newspaper which was pro-governor and another newspaper which was against the government. Like, you had a very critical stance on the government from a Portuguese perspective, yes. So you have that throughout, let me tell you, throughout the let's say, look at the 20th century, until the dictatorship, the right-wing fascist dictatorship of Salazar, because then you had censorship, was a very hard time, and then everything changed after the 1974 Carnation Revolution, the democratic coup, which changed everything, and actually that paved the way for Macau's autonomy, and then for the handover of Macau and the process of decolonization of Portugal and the Portuguese Empire. Remember, Portugal was the last European empire to grant independence to its colonies, and that's because of the imperialist fascist dictatorship between 1933 and 1974. Sorry for using these words.
Very interesting. Any final questions before we finish up?
Emily.
Here, thank you.
So I'm Emily Tran with the Hong Kong Baptist University. I just want to correct myself. The surface of Macau is actually 30 square kilometers, not 34.
Okay, sorry.
Pardon me. I do have a couple of questions,
Go
José.
ahead, Emily.
Having lived in Macau for 13 years and having watched the news program on TV almost daily,
Yes.
I could see the huge difference at times between the news programs in English or Portuguese and the news programs in Chinese. So how do you explain the discrepancies? Is there more self-censorship or censorship for the Chinese team? And did you feel this type of censorship yourself, if you want to share with us? The second question is, why the necessity to create a separate journalist association for Portuguese and English? And why didn't you actually try to join the existing journalist association in Macau? So why didn't you try to come together to the start instead of creating something different?
Great questions, Emily. Thank you very much. Let me start by the latter one, and I'll go to the former one. It was in 2005. I was one of the founding members, but I was a junior journalist. I was not so much involved in the reason why. You did have... okay, let's put it things this way. You've noticed that Macau has been a lot about parallel lives. Chinese, Portuguese, Macanese, and others, right? It's been pretty much, that's the history of Macau, right? You know, it was also, in a way, in many ways, what happened in the journalistic community, right? So it was, there were probably back then specific issues to be addressed by a Portuguese journalist association, let's say, for instance, stand for Portuguese as an official language and to fight for the preservation of this status in real terms, not only officially, not only formally. So this is one of the things. The other thing is that in terms of language ability, the normally Portuguese journalists, most of them, they don't speak Chinese, and the Chinese journalists associations, they are mostly Chinese speaking. So there's an obstacle, language obstacle, to bring about something of that kind. There were, however, Portuguese journalists as members of existing and previous journalist associations in the 1980s and 1990s. Some of the senior Portuguese journalists, a couple of them, or more than a couple, were members of some of those associations. So this happened. But then when so there was no Portuguese language journalist association before the handover, but only after the handover. And then I think the decision was like, we had not only the English media was kicking off, so at an early stage. So the understanding is there was a need to bring journalists from Portuguese and English-speaking media together, non-Chinese-speaking journalists, so they could express their views, their worries, or stand for their interests and rights, and organize talks and training, etc. So there was an affinity in terms of even of a certain view on journalism, if I may say, compared with some other of our colleagues, right? That was the understanding back then, as far as I remember. That would be the rationale behind it. So, but again, as I was saying, my own view is that we should move forward differently, step by step, in forging closer ties with our colleagues from the Chinese-speaking association. And I think it's important for us to learn how to speak Cantonese, and I'm saying Cantonese, of course Mandarin as well, nothing against Mandarin, but I think Cantonese is actually the way to reach out. And also to better understand their circumstances, their environment, without, without preconceived misperceptions. So I think that is what I would really like to do, and to contribute to a small contribution. So one day we may meet differently, but I think that will take time. This stage is too early for us to get there. I have never, your first question, like the second question, I'm an editor, so I make the call on the rundown. So if there's someone to take the heat, is me, right? I've never taken any heat of that kind. So I've never felt that, neither before or after the news was out. I'm not saying that there's no feedback on, of course, what's published, of course, if there's something that is not accurate or not balanced, but not in the sense that I felt that would in any way constrain my editorial autonomy directly or indirectly. So I never felt it as such. So that's why I say no. You see the point? So even, but the fact of the matter is that it's surprisingly, and I shall say, there was, I have never received phone calls like of someone, even on behalf of someone, oh, you should not have had Liu Xiaobo as your top story, or you should not have had that story about the Dalai Lama. And that has never happened, because we do, as you know, we do have those stories, because our take is purely in terms of newsworthiness, as if it's newsworthiness, that of course Liu Xiaobo's case was, for obvious reasons, as the top story, we did it. The difference between English and Portuguese, because again, we are under the same roof, which is the Portuguese channel and the Portuguese newsroom. And then you have a separate unit working separately, which is the Chinese newsroom. I don't know how it works, to be honest. I've tried to learn, I don't know. But it's different, definitely. It's not that it's not reported, sometimes it is, but the way it is and where you find it in the rundown, oh yes, it is different. Again, that would be a great thing to study, to go through, to compare the alignments, the rundowns, and the content and the approaches, and try to look into what is the outcome of news values, or not, or something else. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So you'll be around
Thanks a lot.
Dr. José. Where are you here from? You'll be having drinks at the bar.
Oh yes, I will. Let's come join me. Yes. Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you everybody. You got my contact details. If you come to Macau, do let me know. I can take you to some nice restaurants, and you can drink a bottle of wine. and you can and I can take you to some newsrooms, and I guess we can get to know each other better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, very kind.